According to Catholic teaching, was the American Revolution a just war? In the Bible, we are told that we will judge the world. And if we are to judge the world, then we also have the authority to judge trivial cases. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 2, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? In this video, I want to take the example of the American Revolution and use Catholic teaching to pass judgment on it. This event obviously is honored by many Americans, although it is sometimes seen differently in other places, such as Canada or the United Kingdom. As far as possible, I will try to analyze this objectively using the criteria that the church teaching gives us for evaluating whether a war is just. In the Catechism, under the Fourth Commandment, the text outlines the conditions necessary for an armed insurrection against the government to be considered just. 2243 Armed resistance to oppression by political authority is not legitimate, unless all the following conditions are met. 1. There is certain, grave, and prolonged violation of fundamental rights. 2. All other means of redress have been exhausted. 3. Such resistance will not provoke worse disorders, for there is well-founded hope of success. And 5. It is impossible reasonably to foresee any better solution. With the exception of the fifth point, all of these are echoing the conditions necessary for war, in general, to be just. 2309 The strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modem means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. These are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war doctrine. The evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. Both 2243 and 2309 would apply to the American revolutionaries, but only 2309 would apply to the British Crown or the other nations that got involved in the war. Let's first consider the side of the revolutionaries. To do this, I will first recount the history. The 13 colonies that the United States was first formed from were primarily settled by British and Irish settlers beginning in the early 17th century. Although these colonies were under British rule, Britain gave them a significant degree of autonomy, and the various governments of the different colonies generally made most decisions for themselves apart from Britain. From 1756 to 1763, the 7 Years' War in Europe, also known as the French and Indian War in North America, was fought between alliances of European powers. This war included the colonial powers in Western Europe, and as a result, although most of the war was fought in continental Europe, significant parts of this war were also fought globally, including in the Americas, India, and the Philippines. At the end of this war, Britain took control of the French colonies in North America. The French fur trading area that had covered territory west of the Appalachians also fell into British control. Britain came to the conclusion that the indigenous peoples who lived in this territory and the colonists should be kept separate from each other, otherwise they would create conflicts. Therefore, American colonists were forbidden by the Crown from settling in the territory west of the Appalachians. Some colonists were hoping that they could move into these lands after France's defeat, but the British Crown's decision frustrated their ambitions. The war was financially very costly for Britain, and Britain ended up gaining a large war debt that needed to be paid off. The politicians in Westminster came to the conclusion that the American colonists should have to pay for their own defense, and therefore they should be taxed. Following 1763 and in the next decade leading up to the Revolution, these taxes and decisions that Britain was making on the colonies' behalf made many of the colonists very angry. They were upset by the fact that Britain could impose these measures on them without them seemingly having any say about it. Since the colonies had no representation in the British Parliament in Westminster, and, As British subjects, they believed that only the government that represented them through elections had a right to tax them. The colonies attempted to negotiate with the government in London, but the king and the parliament largely ignored their grievances. Tensions escalated up to 1775, when British forces in Massachusetts attempted to seize weapons that were being stockpiled by colonial militias, and these militias started fighting the British soldiers. Over the next 6 years, American revolutionaries fought across the 13 colonies with British forces. With the victory of American forces at Yorktown in 1781, as well as mounting opposition to the war in Britain, the British government agreed to negotiate and recognize the independence of the colonies. The United States was thus born. Now, let's judge this against what the Catechism says in 2243 about legitimate rebellions. First criterion is that there is a certain grave and prolonged violation of fundamental rights. Looking at this, the first question to ask is, what constitutes fundamental rights? The Catechism doesn't give us a defined list of what is or isn't a fundamental right, but there are some things that indisputably would be included. For example, the right to worship freely, the right to have basic sustenance, the right to raise one's own family, etc. These are fundamental rights because they are things that natural reason will tell you that all human beings are entitled to have, and which governments normally do not have a right to strip away from people. It could be a sin against God for a government to deny food and water to people, to refuse to allow them to worship freely, or forbidding parents to raise their own children. But is it a fundamental right to elect representatives for one's government? Although in American and indeed British political traditions, this may be considered a fundamental political right, but if we want to analyze this critically, I think it is hard to support that claim when we think of church teaching or the teachings of the New Testament. Christ said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." He told his disciples to pay taxes to an emperor who was not elected by them, and indeed was perhaps more corrupt and tyrannical than the British crown. He never said that you only have to give to Caesar when he is representing you through election. Similarly, Paul and Peter in the New Testament also taught the disciples to obey the public authorities because they are God's servants. They say nothing about a supposed fundamental right to have a representational government. From the apostles to the church fathers down to the modern day, the Catholic Church has no example that I can find of a supposed fundamental right for people to have a representational government. Indeed, there are magisterial statements that would seem to contradict this conclusion too. In 1832, Gregory XVI published the encyclical Cum Primum on the topic of civil obedience, which was addressed to the bishops of Poland, where a rebellion against Russian rule had recently occurred. In that letter, the Pope does not say that the people of Poland had a fundamental right to a representative government, but on the contrary, he reiterated the long-held tradition of the Church that the civil authorities needed to be obeyed. Surely the fraud of these would-be teachers must be uncovered in clear words for the good and the instruction of the faithful. The fallacy of their thought must be refuted courageously everywhere with the words of divine Scripture and the testimony of church tradition. From these most pure fountains, from which the Catholic clergy ought to draw the plan of their lives and the material for their sermons to the people, we are taught most clearly that the obedience which men are obliged to render to the authorities established by God is an absolute precept which no one can violate, except if by chance something is commanded which runs counter to the laws of God or of the Church. Let everyone, says the Apostle, be subject to higher authorities, for there exists no authority except from God, and those who exist have been appointed by God. Therefore he who resists the authority resists the ordination of God. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only because of the wrath, but also for conscience sake. Similarly, St. Peter teaches all the faithful, be subject to every human creature for God's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to the governors sent through him. For he says, such is the will of God, that by doing good you would silence the ignorance of foolish men. Governments don't need to be elected in order to be considered as having been appointed by God. If they were not legitimate because they were unelected, then none of this makes any sense, since Tsarist Russia and the Roman Empire were certainly not representative democracies. So, Returning to the American Revolution, just on the first point, it would seem that the revolution fails to be a just war. There is no certain, grave, and prolonged violation of fundamental rights, because this wasn't a fundamental right to begin with. It may have been something that Americans, following British traditions, treasured and thought they were entitled to, but it isn't supported by the gospel or the church. Even just thinking about the church's teaching on legitimate self-defense, the revolutionaries' arguments fall flat. The church teaches in the Fifth Commandment that you can use force, even lethal force, to defend yourself if your life is under physical threat. But that is the only time that violence is permissible. In other words, the only thing that can ever justify violence that takes lives is when someone is doing it to defend life. If a thief is stealing your car, unless you're stranded in the desert and the loss of your car means that you're certainly going to die, you can't legitimately kill the thief in order to stop the theft, because the life of a human being is always worth more than property. People die in wars. Thousands of people died in the American Revolution. Being taxed, even if the taxes were unfair, is hardly a valid justification to take someone's life. It is not a question of give me liberty or give me death, but more properly, it is a question of give me liberty or I will kill you. The right to life is the fundamental right that trumps every other right. One may say it is better to die than it is to be a slave, but it is also still better to be a slave than it is to kill someone who didn't need to die. Let's move on to the second criterion. All other means of redress have been exhausted. Now, for argument's sake, let's suppose that the colonial rebels did satisfy the first criterion, and that their cause was fighting in defense of fundamental rights. We have to assume this, otherwise the other justifications fall apart quite quickly. So just to analyze this academically for the purpose of understanding the doctrine more deeply, we will assume that the first criterion was satisfied. Therefore, for analyzing this and the next several criteria, we will assume that being taxed without representation was a grave violation of fundamental rights, even though in all reason it probably wasn't. The colonial leaders did attempt to reason and negotiate with the Crown and the Parliament to have their grievances addressed, but they met with failure. The Founding Fathers were not itching for a conflict, but they instead hoped that conflict could have been avoided by having their concerns addressed. Maybe there were other nonviolent strategies that they could have tried that may have been more persuasive to the Crown, although I am willing to concede here that the colonial leaders did everything that they could have done to fix this problem of taxation without representation peacefully. Therefore, on the second point, the revolutionaries satisfied this condition to fight a just war. The third criterion. Such resistance will not provoke worse disorders. Now again, if the first criterion isn't true, this one also fails obviously, since any lethal violence at all is a worse disorder than a situation where there was little violence to begin with. War is self-evidently a worse disorder than unfair taxation. But for argument's sake, let us again assume that criterion 1 was satisfied and that the war itself was not a worse disorder than being taxed by an unelected government. Did the American Revolution provoke any other kinds of disorders? Firstly, remember that one of the grievances before the war's outbreak was the fact that the British Crown forbade American colonists to move westwards into indigenous lands. After the war ended and the United States took over these lands, U.S. settlers did in fact go westwards, where they engaged with conflicts with the indigenous peoples and dislodged them from most of their historic homelands, sometimes with large amounts of violence. If the American Revolution was about fighting for the fundamental rights of people, then these indigenous peoples who lost their homelands were obviously also having their own fundamental rights trampled upon. And arguably the warfare and genocide that they were given was worse than the taxes on tea or printed materials that the Crown imposed on the colonies. This also wasn't some far-fetched possibility when the conflict started in 1775 either. Many of the indigenous peoples allied with the Crown against the American revolutionaries during the conflict because they understood that a victory for the revolution was a real threat to their existence. When the war ended, Britain ceded indigenous territory to the American Congress at the treaty negotiations, without ever actually consulting their indigenous allies about this. They continued fighting the United States following Britain's exit from the war, but would be conquered by the Americans in the following decades. Even the few indigenous who actually allied with the American revolutionaries during the war were not much better off. Even though they had fought alongside the revolutionaries as allies, they were also betrayed by the new nation, who likewise also forced them off of their lands and gave those lands to white settlers moving westwards. These indigenous peoples were one of the greatest victims of what resulted from the Revolutionary War. And what happened to them has to be considered in looking at this third criterion in the catechism of whether the war created greater disorders than what it was trying to solve. White colonists in Massachusetts would no longer have to pay taxes imposed on them by those they didn't elect. But Mohawks in upstate New York would literally have their homeland taken away from them forever. Which of these was actually the greater form of tyranny? Another dimension to the American Revolution that can't be forgotten is the fact that it was not just a war between Britain and the colonies, but it was a civil war within the colonies itself. A minority of colonists were loyal to Britain, and some of them also fought alongside the British against the revolutionaries. Loyalists who openly spoke out in favor of the crown could be harassed or threatened. Some of them had their homes burned down, or their own families physically attacked, even killed. Freedom of speech was not really collectively honored by the revolutionaries, because those who supported Britain were sometimes kept silent by terror. This is also another example of the creation of other disorders in order to solve the initial disorder. And we could add other things to this as well. The revolutionaries attempted to invade Canada and failed, since the French Canadians in Quebec didn't support the revolution. The revolution was thus attempting to force populations to join their new nation of liberty against their free will. Had some of the other loyal colonies, such as Nova Scotia or the Caribbean, been more militarily vulnerable, it is also quite plausible that the Continental Congress would have approved attempting to capture these territories too, even though they had never voted to join the new nation. Although it would not have been possible to reasonably predict this in 1775, it is also true that the British Empire outlawed slavery decades before the U.S. Civil War accomplished the same in the United States. Similarly, it would have been difficult to predict this in 1775, but when the Confederacy was formed generations later at the time of the Civil War, the secessionist leaders in the South used the American Revolution to support their arguments that they had a right to secede. If you believe that the 13 colonies had the right to choose their own destiny and become independent if they freely voted for it, then it is not really a far stretch to then argue that the individual states also had the same right once the Union was formed. In conclusion, for the third criterion, I would say that even if we were to grant that warfare itself was not a greater evil than paying taxes to a government you didn't elect, the war itself still produced other consequences, some of which were arguably much more serious than the supposed evil that the war was trying to solve. Some of these consequences could have been easily predicted in 1775. Therefore, because of its failure to satisfy this criterion too, the war was an unjust war. The fourth criterion is there is well-founded hope of success. Now, judging this criterion, we cannot simply look at this in hindsight. The fact that the revolutionaries won the war does not mean that it was likely that they were going to win, or that knowing what they knew in 1775, they could have reasonably predicted their victory. If you consider the advantages that Britain held at the start of the war, you will realize that it was not a foregone conclusion that Britain would have lost this war. Britain had several times the population of the 13 colonies, with larger armed forces, navy, and manufacturing. In 1775, it took a longer time for people to travel over land from Massachusetts to Georgia than it took for ships to cross the sea from Britain to the colonies. The colonial roads were also typically much slower forms of transportation than sea routes along the eastern seaboard. The colonies didn't really have an effective navy, and Britain's navy was one of the world's largest. Because of this naval advantage, to some degree the British could pick and choose where they wanted to deploy armies in the colonies, and they could theoretically attack where the revolutionaries were weaker and withdraw from where they were stronger. Now, although they had this advantage, whether their generals were competent enough to use this effectively during the war is a different question. But for our purposes, when looking at the ground in 1775, we just need to realize that that advantage was theoretically present. Even more critically than this was the fact that the colonies didn't make very much gunpowder at that time. Gunpowder was made from water, charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter. Charcoal and water you can get from anywhere. Saltpeter could be mined where deposits existed or produced using chemical processes. Sulfur needed to be mined or collected from volcanic deposits, and there wasn't much sulfur mined in the colonies before 1775. These ingredients then need to be mixed together at a powder mill, and in 1775, the colonies only had 3 such mills in operation. Before the war, the colonies relied on Britain for their supplies of gunpowder. When the colonies started their rebellion, the fact that they didn't make much gunpowder themselves was an obvious strategic shortcoming. The rebels tried to ramp up local production of gunpowder in the colonies themselves. They tried to capture British supplies of gunpowder, even resorting to piracy on the high seas, and they also used blockade runners to go to the French West Indies to buy gunpowder. They almost ran out of gunpowder completely within the first year of the war, but beginning in 1776, the French began smuggling massive supplies of gunpowder to the rebels. If the French hadn't done this, the rebellion arguably might have failed. If you had known all of this in 1775, you probably would not have thought it inevitable at all that the rebels were going to win the war. To judge this fourth criterion, we have to think of what people knew in 1775, not simply looking at this in hindsight from future history. When the war starts, is there a well-founded hope of victory? In order for the war to be a just war, this hope has to be present. When the Catechism says that a well-founded hope of success is needed, I don't assume that it means that victory is assured, but I do assume it means that victory was more likely than failure. Think of it like investing. If you're putting your entire life savings into the stock market, it would be foolish to put it all into high-risk ventures that have a high rate of failure. If your livelihood and your financial future depends on it, then you should invest it in things that are likely to bear profit. It doesn't need to be certain, but it should be safe enough that failure is an unlikely outcome, since so much depends on it. In a revolution, you are gambling not just with your life savings, but with the welfare of the entire country. Many revolutions don't succeed, and they end up plunging the country into a far worse state than what they had been before the war began. Knowing these things in 1775, was victory really more likely than failure for the colonies? This is a subjective judgment, and people can come to different conclusions about this. But in my subjective opinion, since the colonies hadn't secured a stable supply of gunpowder before the war began, this one fact alone made the fate of the rebellion too uncertain to judge it to have had a well-founded hope. The other disadvantages the colonies had could be added on top of this, but this one issue could have broken the rebellion entirely had they not found a solution early enough. I could perhaps compare it with the current conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine arguably would barely have stood a chance at resisting Russia for as long as it had if the West had not supplied it with weapons. Now, when Russia attacked, the West very quickly started supplying Ukraine with large amounts of weapons, as well as promises for more. But suppose that didn't happen and Ukraine had been given no such promises of weapons delivery. Ukraine would not have had a well-founded hope of success then, and armed resistance perhaps would just be prolonging the inevitable. Now think of alternate possibilities of how events could have played out after the colonies started their insurrection. Suppose that the British were smarter and they destroyed those 3 powder mills in the colonies that comprised the colony's entire gunpowder production early in the conflict, while the French chose not to supply the rebels with gunpowder. The rebels would then have been left with using bows and arrows to fight the British army. People can come to a different conclusion about this, but while there may have been a hope of victory, in my subjective opinion, it was not a well-founded hope in 1775. And therefore, in my subjective opinion, this fourth criterion is also not satisfied, and the war was an unjust war. The fifth criterion is, it is impossible reasonably to foresee any better solution. This criterion separates armed rebellion from war in general. If your country is invaded, you have a right to fight back without thought about how long this invasion will continue. But if you are living under oppression, whether or not you start fighting has to also take into account of whether better options to solve the problem might come in the future. With the American Revolution, this is an interesting point to consider. The British Parliament in Westminster did in fact have debates among the politicians elected by the people of Britain about the justice of how the colonies were being treated. Although the Prime Minister and the government followed policies that led to the revolution, there wasn't unanimous support for this. Is it possible that in some future British elections, a new government could have come to power that would have wanted to change directions on this issue? Indeed, in the century that followed, Britain had a great deal of political reform that occurred at home. Other colonies, such as in Canada or Australia, were eventually given responsible government and then almost complete autonomy from Westminster without armed revolutions. Whether or not someone could have predicted this in 1775 is a different question, but note that the Catechism here doesn't say that a person needs to be certain that an alternative solution will come. Rather, the burden of proof is in the opposite direction. The text says that it is impossible to foresee another solution, which means that you don't need to be certain that there will be an alternative solution, but rather you need to be certain that there won't be an alternative solution. As long as there is a possibility that the solution might come peacefully, armed rebellion cannot be justified. Even if it is unlikely that such a solution would come, according to the text of the Catechism, you have to reach the point where it is not just unlikely, but impossible that such a solution will come, and only then can armed rebellion be justified. Life is the right that trumps all other rights. Killing must be the very last solution, once no other solution is reasonably possible. As long as there is some reasonable possibility that the situation could have been solved peacefully, violence loses its justification. Keep in mind that 1763 to 1775 was only 12 years. The supposedly oppressive taxation without representation lasted a shorter time than the careers of many politicians in the U.S. Congress and Senate. An observer in 1775 certainly could have considered it reasonably possible to think that the politics in Westminster could have changed in the future, even though it was not listening in the present. Therefore, in my opinion, I think the fifth point is also not satisfied, and therefore the war was unjustified on this point too. In conclusion, the American Revolution from the side of the revolutionaries was an unjust war according to my interpretation of Catholic teaching. In order for it to be a just war, it needs to satisfy all 5 of these criteria. But in my view, it fails on 4 of the 5 criteria. Only criterion 2 could it have theoretically satisfied. But even this it didn't really satisfy, since criterion 2 cannot be true if criterion 1 is false. Let us now do the other side in the conflict. Were the British fighting a just war? To judge this, we need to look at the Catechism again, but this time we will look at what the Catechism defines as a just war in general and not simply armed resistance against oppression. 2309, the strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modem means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. For this, it has 4 conditions which mirror the first 4 conditions of a just armed rebellion. Note that the Church only teaches that war is justified when it is done in defense. There is no such thing as a just aggressive war. The only thing that can justify lethal violence is if it is being done in response to lethal violence. There is no other justification. The first point, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. Were the rebels inflicting damage that was lasting, grave, and certain? Lasting here, I interpret it to mean that the violence is expected to be lasting, not that it had to have lasted a long time already before a country is allowed to fight back. If another nation invades your nation, you don't need to wait for many months or years to pass before you have a right to start defending yourself. But you need only be able to reasonably anticipate that this is not just a short incursion that will be over soon if you did nothing in response to it. For example, if in modern times, an airplane of one country flies over another country to fire a missile and assassinate a single person, and it is unlikely to do more violence than this, then the nation that was attacked would probably not be justified to respond to this by fighting a war, since the violence is not expected to be lasting. The logic is that wars are only legitimate when they are necessary to defend life. If the violence is likely going to end soon without the need for you to use force to fight back, then you no longer have a justification to fight back, even though you may think it is necessary to take revenge. For the British, they could have certainly come to the reasonable conclusion that the American rebels were using lethal violence against their soldiers that was going to keep continuing without a quick end. Therefore, it was lasting. By grave, as I interpreted before, it has to be done in defense of life. For the British side, and indeed any government fighting against an armed rebellion, this is easy to argue. If the rebels are killing people to fight their rebellion, then the damage is therefore grave. Consider Gandhi in India, who used nonviolent resistance to win independence for India from Britain. He and his followers refused to comply with British laws, but they refused to use violence. In India, Britain had no justification to use violence to put down the Indian rebels, since the damage was not grave. Only defense of life can ever justify the taking of a life. India was not a Christian country, but Gandhi used a teaching from the gospel to lead his independence movement. On the other hand, America, a supposedly Christian country, used violence to fight for freedom for Britain. By choosing violence, they took many lives, and therefore from the perspective of this teaching in the Catechism, this lasting damage was also grave in nature. By certain, it means that there is no doubt about it. It is not based on a conspiracy theory or uncertain intelligence. For example, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, their invasion was justified on intelligence that obviously wasn't certain, since it turned out to be greatly mistaken. The Iraq War would have failed just on this point to be a just war, since its justification lacks certainty. Wars that are fought preemptively often fail on this point, since when you're attacking the other country first in order to avoid the other country doing the same to you, it is usually based on a probable or possible threat, not a certain threat. The Catechism requires that the threat be certain, not simply probable. Otherwise, the war is unjustified. With regard to the British side during the American Revolution, there wasn't any reasonable doubt to the question that American militiamen had started shooting at British infantry in Massachusetts and later other places when the rebellion began. The first shots of the war were between soldiers and militiamen who had clearly come to fight the soldiers with violent resistance. Therefore, this lasting and grave damage was also certain. Therefore, in my analysis, the British side then satisfies the conditions of the first point. The second point, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Now we know from history that the American leaders had been trying to negotiate with London for a decade before the war began to solve what they felt was their unfair treatment. The revolutionary leaders did not actually want the war. They would have preferred a peaceful settlement that solved this issue of taxation without representation. If the Crown and the Parliament in Westminster had listened to them, or at least found some solution that satisfied them, then the entire war likely could have been averted. Westminster may have believed that their position was right, because why shouldn't the colonies have to help pay back the war debt of the 7 Years' War? But the question you have to address is not whether it was right or wrong, but rather whether it was impractical or ineffective. Even if Britain was right and the colonies were wrong, unless it was impractical or ineffective to find some other solution to this problem that was going to cause the war, then the British side fails to be justified under this condition. Let me give an example to illustrate this logic. Prior to the Second World War, Hitler annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and the other nations of Europe didn't go to war with Germany because they hoped that appeasing Hitler would avoid conflict. Arguably, Germany's annexation of these territories was unjust, but if giving these territories to Germany actually did result in avoiding another conflict, then even though it was wrong for Germany to take these territories, such a solution would have been effective and practical at avoiding a war. According to what the Catechism teaches on the second point, since this solution was able to avoid the war, even though it was unjust, then the countries involved must use that unjust solution rather than fight a war, because war is the very last resort. In reality, we know that it was not effective at avoiding a war, since Hitler wasn't willing to stop there. But simply thinking of this hypothetical alternative history as an example, this is how I believe we should interpret the Catechism. The solution doesn't need to be a just solution. It only needs to be a practical and effective solution. By practical, I would interpret this to mean that it is something that is realistic. For example, suppose in ancient times you had an empire that demanded a smaller nation pay them a grain tribute, but the tribute demand was so large that if the smaller nation gave it, it would leave their own people at risk of famine. Giving the food over as tribute to the empire would perhaps be a possible solution at avoiding war, but it would not be a practical solution. Now, suppose that the tribute demand was smaller, and while it would have left the smaller nation with less, it would still have left them with enough to get by. In that case, the solution would perhaps be practical, and the smaller nation should perhaps give the tribute, even if the tribute is unfair, rather than causing a war. By effective, I would interpret this to mean that the solution actually is likely going to avoid the war. For example, appeasing Hitler was a hopeful solution at avoiding war in Europe, but it was not an effective solution, since war was still going to come anyways. Returning back to our main topic and judging whether Britain satisfied this condition. Even if we assume that the British side was right and the colonies were wrong, and that the British were in the right to tax the colonies to pay for the war debt, this doesn't excuse them from finding another solution that would have avoided the conflict. As long as there is some other solution that is both practical and effective, even if that solution is unjust, war cannot be justified. The right to life is the right that trumps every other right. If you have to make unfair concessions to the other side, whatever it is that you're giving up is always going to be worth less than the value of a single human life. Lethal violence can only be justified in defense of life. If peacefully giving up territory, money, resources, etc., is both practical and effective at avoiding a war, then you need to do that, even if you see such concessions are unfair, since these things are always worth less than human lives. Taking this interpretation, it seems to my subjective viewpoint that Britain could have certainly found a way to peacefully appease the colonies without the need for war. Maybe they could have somehow changed the British Parliament in Westminster so that the colonies were able to have their own representatives to vote in the House of Commons. Maybe they could just continue what they had before the 7 Years' War and use primarily British taxpayers to pay for the British military presence in North America. Maybe they could decide not to defend the colonies in the future with their own military and let the colonies finance their defense entirely on their own. Maybe there were other solutions to this too. The fact that the colonial leaders were trying to get Britain to listen to them before the rebellion began is proof enough that peace was probably possible and war was not inevitable. Therefore, in my subjective opinion, I believe that Britain failed to satisfy the requirements of this second point, and therefore the British were also fighting an unjust war as a result of that failure. The third condition, there must be serious prospects of success. Again, we have to look at this from the perspective of the time, and we can't just look at it in hindsight. The fact that Britain lost the war does not mean that in 1775 a reasonable person must have assumed that that ending was likely. Britain had many reasons to think that they could have won this war when it began, which I've already mentioned. In 1775, Britain didn't yet know that France was going to join the war, nor did it know that France was going to solve the colony's gunpowder shortage. In 1775, Britain didn't know that its generals were going to commit blunders in the course of the war that would allow the rebels to secure major victories, such as at Saratoga or Yorktown. In 1775, Britain didn't know that the colonies, which didn't really have an effective navy or a standing army beyond local militias, were going to mobilize their resources to make an army that would be able to stand effectively against the British Army and defeat it on the battlefield. The colonies were a huge territory with millions of people, and Britain's army in 1775 was nowhere near large enough that they could have hoped to run an effective military occupation of the entire territory. But in 1775, they also didn't know if that was going to be necessary. Indeed, if the British generals actually did succeed in decisively defeating Washington and the other rebel generals on the battlefield, who knows what would have happened afterwards? Unity among the colonies was not easy to achieve, and if their forces were decisively defeated, maybe some of the colonial governments would have capitulated and asked for clemency from Britain, while abandoning the others who wanted to continue the fight. Maybe support for the rebellion would wane if people saw that the British were beating them. It is hard to know what would really happen in alternative histories. However, the point to make here is that just because Britain lost the war, that doesn't mean that the British side was making a mistake when, looking at what they knew in 1775, they thought that victory was possible or even likely. In my subjective opinion, I think that in 1775, this point was satisfied for the British side. They did have serious prospects of success. Not certain prospects, of course, but looking at all of these facts, it was not unreasonable for someone to think that Britain was likely to win. As the war dragged on and these facts changed, the hopes for a British victory became less and less likely. And once it became unlikely that they could win the war, this point then was no longer satisfied for them. I'm not sure exactly when I would say that that point occurred, although I think it likely had already come before Yorktown. Maybe when the British were defeated at Saratoga and the French directly entered the war, at that point we could say that Britain no longer had a well-founded hope of victory, and at that point in time, it was an unjust war if they tried to continue it. If you can't win, then you can't justify continuing the fight, since continuing the fight just means more death, but lives are being sacrificed to achieve something that likely can't be achieved. In other words, at that point, the lives are likely being sacrificed for nothing, and therefore the war becomes unjust. So, in summary, in my subjective opinion, I think this point was satisfied for Britain at the start of the war, but was probably not satisfied after the war had progressed and the revolutionaries firmly gained the upper hand. The fourth condition: the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The evil that Britain was seeking to eliminate were the rebels who were using violence against them and who had started the war. I've already mentioned some of the evils that the revolutionaries were responsible for. Britain's hands were not clean either, however. Similar to how loyalists living in areas controlled by the revolution were not safe, even if they were civilians, those who had sympathies for the revolution could also be treated harshly by British forces or loyalist Americans in areas controlled by Britain. There were some atrocities committed against civilians who supported the revolution, including by Britain's indigenous allies. Revolutionary soldiers who surrendered were often treated as traitors and criminals rather than as prisoners of war, and many of them died in British custody. The question for us to answer is whether these evils perpetrated to defeat the rebellion were greater than the evil to be eliminated. It is hard to definitively gauge whether one evil is greater than another, although in my subjective opinion, I would reason that it is not a crime in principle for a country to punish people who engage in insurrection. George Washington, the Founding Fathers, and those who supported them were indeed engaging in insurrection against the lawful government. I've already gone into detail about how this rebellion was also not really a just war in my subjective interpretation of the Catechism, as well as the fact that a government does not need to be elected in order to hold the legitimate authority to govern that comes from God according to church teaching. From that perspective, at least in principle, Britain was not doing something wrong with punishing people who joined or supported the rebellion. In principle, civilians who assist in insurrection can also be legitimately punished by the lawful authorities. Now, that doesn't excuse use of capital punishment, which is condemned by the church today, nor does it excuse some of the atrocities when civilians were massacred without any sort of due process. It also doesn't excuse the horrible treatment of American POWs that led to them dying in large numbers in British prisons. But the question for us to answer is whether these crimes committed on the British side were worse than the evil they were seeking to defeat. In my subjective opinion, I would say no for 3 reasons. First, the war itself, which was started by the rebels, was going to kill far more people and do more damage than these atrocities, which, while terrible, were not really being done at a scale that would have exceeded the evil of the war itself in its entirety. Second, The revolutionaries were doing the same sorts of things against loyalists who lived in the territories that they controlled. But unlike the British, who in principle could justify their punishment by the fact that they held legitimate legal authority, the revolutionaries held no such legitimate authority when they were punishing people. The revolutionaries were terrorizing and burning the homes of people who were trying to stay loyal to the same country that they and their ancestors had belonged to for centuries. Third, the revolutionaries were also hoping to use the war to take land from the indigenous people or to conquer Canada, regardless of whether Canada was willing to be part of the new nation. Britain certainly engaged in hostile colonialism over indigenous peoples and aggressive conflicts in other times and places, but at least in the course of this particular war, they were not attempting to do that. Therefore, the revolutionaries on this point were perhaps a greater evil. In my fallible and subjective opinion, I would thus reason that the British were not committing greater evil than what they were fighting against, and therefore they satisfied this fourth point in the just war doctrine. In conclusion, according to my fallible interpretation, I think Britain satisfied at least 3 of the 4 points. But in order for a war to be justified, all 4 of these points must be satisfied. And therefore, because Britain failed to satisfy the second point, for Britain this was also an unjust war. These are all just my opinions and my own flawed understanding of history, of course. So feel free to disagree if you can interpret these teachings from the church and come up with a different conclusion. Consider this verse. Luke 16, verse 15, and he said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of men. But God knows your hearts. For what is lifted up by men is an abomination in the sight of God." Although this war is celebrated by Americans every year on July 4th, including many American Catholics, as the birth of their country, the question of whether God saw this war with approval is a different question. At the end of the world, when the books of judgment are opened and all of human history is judged, many people perhaps may be surprised to find that many things that they assumed at the time were righteous deeds were actually abominable or sinful in God's sight. We should not underestimate the degree to which we human beings have gone astray from God across our history. I think that most wars in history probably fail to be justified wars when measured against what the church teaches, although human beings tend to celebrate those wars that defined, created, liberated, or seemingly gave glory to their nations. Ultimately, we have to remember that if we are in God's kingdom, then we belong to a higher country, one that is not of this world. This kingdom will last forever, but the countries that we have now will eventually come to an end.